Hey guys, welcome to the Defining Quality in Concentrates webinar. Um, so just for anybody who's new to GoToWebinar app, there's a question box on the right-hand side. Let's give it a shot. Why don't we, everybody who's here, let me know where you're tuning in from. What state are you in? What province are you in? What country are you in? All right, Evan's from Arizona.
Oh, hi, Evan. I know Evan.
Nikki, Colorado, one of our teammates there. St. Louis, Matt from Ontario, Eugene,
Oh, good
Oregon,
spread.
Tacoma, Washington. We got a pretty good dispersion here of every.
Nova Scotia. Everybody forgets about Nova Scotia.
How could you forget about Nova Scotia?
At least as far as cannabis is concerned, I never associate the two in my mind, you know.
Yeah, the Maritimes always gets forgotten. Sorry, Maritimes.
Too far away. Yeah, we just
Forgotten corner of North America. Same with Maine. I've heard amazing things about Maine. Good
Oh,
cannabis
Maine's
community
the
there too.
best. Maine doesn't want you to hear about it. That's how they keep it good, you know.
The
They're secret
forgotten
on
state.
purpose. Yeah.
Nicest weed I've seen in the States came from Maine.
Yeah,
Man,
I've
best
heard it's.
sandwiches I've ever had in Maine, like best rental car I've ever had in Maine. Everything there.
I've yet to
Top
visit.
tier.
I'm looking forward to my first landing in Maine.
It's one of the few places left where you can grow weed at home as a caregiver and sell it to a dispensary.
You can sell it if it's homegrown. No wonder the weed's so good.
Yeah, that's why I bring it up. Everyone talks about, oh, the weed's so good there. Yeah, because it's from somebody's closet.
Yeah,
It's just
grown
easier to
with
do a
love.
good job, you know?
And that's one definition of quality that we will definitely be covering in the Defining Quality Concentrates webinar. But we are
Yeah.
just kind of waiting for folks to roll in here, so we'll get started soon. But thanks for your patience if you're already here. Give it a minute.
The recordings are usually available later. Ken just asked that. I don't
Yep.
know who's in charge of that, but somebody does it every time, I think.
Yeah, our wonderful Isamar creates a recording. She'll send out an email. Um, and also, like, if there's any questions that people have along the way that we don't get to, feel free to just like drop them in the question box. And we do have people following up on those as well. And just kind of, we'll reach out to you by email. We've got your email addresses. And everybody here will get a email with the recording as well. So we might as well dive into it. Why don't we jump in there, Murphy?
Yeah. Hey, everybody, it's us.
I don't
Want to
think
do a quick
oh,
intro?
there you go. Yeah, just a quick intro. So introducing Murphy Murri, our kind of resident expert extraordinaire, consultant in the space. So we do kind of recommend Murphy for any consulting projects that kind of overlap between quality and extraction. But just general extraction efficiency. I don't know if you want to mention any of the services that you offer there, Murphy, while you have the opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. I use the word consultant because it's all encompassing, but at the same time, a little meaningless. But what I really help people with is to just achieve their goals, whatever your goals might be. And usually that starts with figuring out what your problems are. And so, as a consultant, I provide support to labs, whether you're buying new equipment, trying to figure out why your current equipment doesn't work, hiring and training new staff, or educating and retraining current staff. A lot of product development work, which spans, developing new products, which is fun and exciting, and trying to fix old products, which is differently exciting. And, I do quite a bit of like new lab design as well. But I would say the solving problems part of my job is sometimes the part you hear about the least. It's much easier. Everybody wants me to post a picture of the brand new lab. Not everybody wants me to post a picture of like the worst hash they ever made and how we fixed it. So I'm excited for this webinar to be able to talk about the less glamorous but more important side of the work that I do, I would say.
Absolutely. And thanks for that, Murphy. I'm Adam Temple. I'm CEO of Evolved Extraction Solutions, and there's a lot of overlap in what we do there. We help our clients identify problems that they need to solve in the lab, and we also have the hardware solution. So where Murphy comes in on more of the process side, potentially the product development side, that's kind of where we would recommend Murphy, and then she would recommend us probably on the equipment side where there's a hardware needed for the solution. And a lot of our hardware also where there's a big overlap here with this webinar is we help our extractors produce more profitability and through delivering consistent and repeatable extractions. And that's really what this webinar is all about. In order to do that, in order to deliver the hardware systems that help our clients accelerate profits and increase consistency of their production and their outputs. We also have a R&D lab in partnership with Senti Solutions. We call it the Genome Technology Center. Our genome platform is really centers around the crystallization tech, but it's a whole hydrocarbon extraction platform, and we develop that every single day in our R&D facility. It's actually open to the public as long as you're, an extractor. You can come and visit this facility, and this is where Imran works. So this is kind of my segue into introducing Imran, who focuses on developing the technology and testing out new processes every single day at the Genome Technology Center. If you want to say a few words, Imran, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Adam, and also great to be on here with Murphy because like Murphy's who I go to when I want to learn stuff. But yeah, Adam's not wrong. This genome center is basically like my second or first home. I essentially spend good chunk of my time here. Ideally, at the moment, working a lot on precipitation of cannabinoids out of micella. So a lot of work involved in what we might call crystallization, but it's just rapid precipitation of cannabinoids out of hydrocarbon solutions. And then if I'm not doing that, then oftentimes I'm going and helping with installs and often the operator training that is connected to the processes that I have helped develop over here, or some of the products and parts of system equipment that we've worked on over here. So it kind of translates. I take what I've been doing and show other people how to do it.
Awesome. Thanks for that, guys. So today we're really going to kind of zoom in on creating more clear definitions for quality. What does quality mean in concentrates? I think that there's at least two, maybe up to 7 different definitions, depending on who you ask. So we're going to really hone in on who this webinar is for and how we define quality in the scope of who we're defining it for, and what are the measurable parameters and standards that we can implement to measure and produce repeatable quality. That includes validation variables. We're going to touch on our crystallization technology, which can deliver repeatable processes and help with the, making, reducing variables, although we can never eliminate them. And a little bit on our how to audit for quality and some of the common production challenges to address, as well as formulations and real world problem solving. And throughout, just feel free to jump into the to the question box at any point. Like if there's something that sparks your curiosity, we like to make these webinars pretty interactive. So give us feedback along the way about what to talk about. We're happy to kind of where it makes sense to jump into it. And if we are not able to kind of address it immediately, then we'll typically do that towards the end of the Q&A. Murphy, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this particular webinar topic, some of you might have, attended previous webinars, which has been largely more about specific processes. This webinar, started like most of my relationship with Evolved from, social media polls and trying to just check in on you guys out there. And so I started this year with a poll about what is everybody focusing on this year? There's a lot going on in, the rules, the world, the labs. And so, just in asking a broad open question, what are labs prioritizing for 2026? What does your business care about today? I threw out a lot of different options, and some of them are obvious, like make more money. Some of them are less obvious, like improve training or employee retention. But the one that came up on top by like almost 50% is to improve quality. And, that led to a conversation Adam and I had, which is what does everybody mean by that? Because there's a lot of different definitions. And when we talk, in the R&D lab, we have the convenience and luxury of the world's biggest C1D1, all of the stainless you could want, but no control over the quality of your input materials. Meanwhile, when I'm out with a client, they might have exclusive control over their input materials, but very limited access to their hardware, or a very small room to work within, or, these other opposite parameters and constraints. And then, when you look at like the highly structured nature of a nationwide program like Canada's cannabis program versus the segmented individual states and municipalities that we have down here, you have another entire layer of quality control that is more in the compliance oriented field. And so, we threw out a couple more questions, and I tried to figure out from people, when you're talking about quality control, what are your issues? Are we talking about recall types of contamination? Are we talking about heavy metals and pesticides, which are everywhere and we never want to talk about it, or are we talking about how my sugar is more butter or batter and my diamonds are more sugar? Are we talking about vapes that clog? Are we talking about incomplete decarb? Are we talking about dark colors, off odors? And so, we try to throw out these questions all the time. Anytime you see a random poll, please participate. Science requires data, and the more you guys can throw in, the better. And so, in preparing for this webinar, we wanted to hear from people, really, what are your problems in the lab? We talk a lot about crystallization because we see it as such a good solution for a lot of those problems. But it's easy to have a blind spot. And so, when we're asking people for their input, what we want to know is, if you have a problem of weird oil, oh, this might be loud. Sorry. There we go. If you have oil that's not doing what you expected, how do you deal with those problems? Because everybody has lots of different issues in the lab. But one thing that I think everyone can get a little more aligned on is how they solve for those issues in the lab.
Hey, Murphy, if you go back to that last slide, just noticing effectively 100%.
I don't know how to go backwards. Hold on.
Try the left arrow.
Yeah, left arrow.
There we go.
There you go. 43% inconsistent textures, 29% batches not matching, material that just won't turn out what I want. That to me is 100% repeatable processing, repeatable or repeatable output, because a repeatable process isn't always going to produce the exact same output depending on the variables. But what it seems to be 100% is They want something that is a result that's repeatable.
Yeah, they want less surprises, Um,
Don't we all?
Can you click that video again?
predictability.
Can you just click that play button again real quick?
Yeah.
It might not be super easy to see it, but if you see how on the left side, just where you can actually kind of see the bottom of the sea vault, there is actually, it's a layer of crystals down there. Like it did sugar up below this. So people asked, I think you would ask them like, what's wrong with this particular picture? And it actually does contain THCA in there. It wasn't that it was completely decarbed, even though it was the material that was used to produce this was stored terribly. It still shows that even after being treated really poorly, like there was still enough THCA content for it to crystallize. It's just that you could see there was a lot of other problems in there, that the temperatures that they were exposed to probably contributed to like degradation of the other compounds that are present. And that's what you ended up with, this like soup of kind of nasty smelling viscous goo that sits on top of a layer, which arguably could be worked with.
Yeah, one thing that I also want to point out is the answer that just blames noobs. I think that while that one's funny in its phrasing, across every industry, it is very common for people to inaccurately blame people for bad processes. And so I would say, with the exception of like, making sourdough bread at home, right? Like if we're talking about manufacturing in a business, if it is possible for someone's experience level to be the reason that an SOP failed, that's your fault. That's a bad process. That's something that should have never been possible. Someone who has done this SOP 2 times versus 20 times should have relatively the same likelihood of success if the process is very solid. And so if your process comes apart based on the individual operator, it's a bad one. And, that's where your quality system starts breaking down. People are certainly capable of being the root cause, but that's not as common as people like to think. You should have a process with enough, controls and decision making in, opportunities for someone being new to not be a risk to that product quality. People do make mistakes, but that is usually not the reason why we have sugars that are batters and sauce and diamonds that's more sugary. Like those are not noob issues, those are process issues. And if it just requires repetition of doing it wrong enough times to get it right, that's still a process issue. It's almost never the people. We love to blame the people. If your process is good enough, it's probably not the noobs.
So jumping into how do we define quality, and I think this is really at the crux of the challenge in kind of discussing quality is that it means something different to everybody. So really, like the main people that might have a different definition of quality are primarily like consumers. There's like, what does a consumer consider to be good? That's one definition of quality. What this webinar is really going to focus in on is kind of the middle group here: business owners, laboratory staff, and quality assurance and compliance staff. And then there's another whole definition, maybe regulators. Quality is going to mean something completely different to regulators. We're going to take that as kind of table stakes for this webinar. We're going to assume that compliance is in place. And everything we're going to focus on is just about how to produce a repeatable product, for business owners, staff extracting, and in conformance with kind of quality assurance standards. But I think it's really important also to touch on what Imran's, as a kind of an extractor. you're always trying to make something that the consumers want. And so that it's important to make that distinction. That's not, that it's not something to turn your shoulder to, for example. You want to touch on that, Imran?
Sure. Yeah. Between us, we had a conversation where myself, I was a little hung up about this word. I guess even myself, I was misunderstanding the scope of our conversation. And I basically presented it like this, which was I said, um, with all due respect, I don't even think consumers have a genuine understanding of what quality is. They sort of have they have a hard time, you know. They have to pick pieces of information, what a friend tells them, what their friend who's an extractor tells them, what they read on the internet, what their favorite influencer they follow tells them is quality. It's not an easy job. And then of course, what they might have determined on their own through their own personal experiences, and they put all this information together, and now they've got like, this is my quality standard.
Mm,
Well, and then, hey, maybe word gets around and that influencer is doing their job as an influencer, and now you've got a lot of people who all think this one particular thing is quality, and it kind of feeds up the line to impact the extractor and perhaps even the business owner to say, oh, we've got all these people that demand that extract A look just like this, and that can conflict with what the actual operator thinks is quality, or what the lead extractor thinks are quality, or anyone there occurs with. So to make things simpler for ourselves and also for the audience here today, just as
Adam.
Adam was explaining, and as Murphy clarified for me, was put that aside for the moment and realize that, like, we now have to accept that our goal is to be able to make whatever they want, but to always be able to make what we intend to make, and not like just accidentally be producing things and say, oh great, we've made this kind of diamonds today, or we've made like pull and snap. Like, it I guess if quality boils down to a single term, it's just is essentially repeatability for the sake of for this conversation. And please, Murphy and or Adam, if I've misconstrued our previous conversation, please jump in. But I think that's probably the easiest way to have this conversation, because otherwise you just get way too tangled up in debating over who's right about what quality is, and that's I don't think a conversation we're prepared to go down in an hour. So yeah, that's where we are today with this.
Yeah, I think I would sum that up almost by saying, quality is agnostic of preference. So, our assumption is that everyone prefers the highest quality version of the thing from a consumer level experience. So, whether you're going to eat Wagyu steak or a hot dog, we're going to assume you want the highest quality version of a hot dog or of a steak or of a burger. It's like whatever, if you don't like shatter at all, you can still conceptualize a high quality shatter. And if you don't like diamonds at all, you can still conceptualize a high quality isolate. And so when we're talking about quality, our goal is to be the epitome, the utmost potential of whatever thing we're trying to make. Whether you like that thing or not is kind of irrelevant to the goal of pursuing the highest quality version of it. So, preference is a side of that.
Yeah,
Well, and while it's aside, consumer preference is a super important thing that comes upstream of quality, because whoever you're trying to target as an extractor, whoever your ideal customer is and what their preferences are going to feed into the parameters that you actually set to make repeatable. And maybe that is shatter. Maybe that's actually you want the lowest cost shatter on the market. Well, in order to make the lowest cost shatter on the market, potentially there are certain parameters that you actually have to set to target that specific customer profile and those preferences. And the repeatability of that is really what we're addressing here in this webinar, is like, how do you make that repeatable? What parameters can you control for? And how do you produce the exact same product every single time in a repeatable way.
Yeah, one thing I think about a lot is how often there's commentary from the consumer end, from the dispensary counter end, where they're talking about the way a product looks, whereas extractors might care a little bit less about how it looks. And the difference between those two is that the extractors got to see it and smell it throughout the process, and consumers only get to see it at the very end. And so if a consumer has a memory of a quality experience that they had that was associated then permanently in their brain forever as this warm honey yellow, then when they see a darker red amber, they are just not aligning. They need, more exposure to those delicious, high quality, darker red amber colored products to gain the same experience that the extractor in the lab might have. And so, when we think about this quality definition issue, the parameters that are available to us really shape how we measure that individually. And so consumers, in many cases, don't get to smell it before they buy it. And if they do, it's like a shared smell container that's been opened 6,000 times, which I have personal grievances with as well. So, it's really hard to satisfy them any way other than visually.
I have
But it doesn't mean we can't satisfy that visual aspect.
I just wanted to jump in there. There's another, I have like a theory about this, which if you go to the cannabis extracts subreddit, the top thing is it's a sticky post that says, remember, your eyes are not a good judge of quality. And like what that's saying is, it's not discounting that like you can use them, but don't rely on them as the only way to tell. And I think, and my personal theory of this is that like extracts as a class are one that consumers are probably less familiar with than straight flower, where people are more used to using their senses, and maybe the eyes are a little bit better at detecting because we know what degraded leaves look like, we know what browning of flower looks like, we are familiar with this. But extracts sort of enter into a realm, for consumers anyway, that might be more on the realm of magic because they just don't really understand. And for example, a lot of people are pretty hot under the collar about the idea that we can play with color. And now all of a sudden we are like dark wizards who are tricking them into misbelieving what good and bad actually is, when for themselves, if you go back to flower, color is, everyone's seen what like old weed looks like and how the color kind of gets bleached out of it, and they say, I can trust my eyes here. But if you tell people now that their eyes can be deceived, now you've made them feel uncomfortable about what they were previously comfortable about. And now they've entered this sense of like, oh, so these guys are tricksters. They're just out here to fool us. And like, we can't trust anything they say. So that's just sort of my theory on why it's kind of gone down this path for the consumer anyway. Like you mentioned, Murphy, like how consumers and extractors, you were saying like, well, extractors actually get to see the process. That's exactly it. They get to see the process. They know what they're doing, and the consumer doesn't. So, in absence of that sort of connection to the process, they often will assume bad things. And let's be fair, like coming out of the black market, they have had the wool pulled over their eyes a few times. So it's understandable that they might have this PTSD about it. But sorry, didn't want to ramble on too much. Just wanted to get it out there about that.
Yeah, well, I think they struggle with unrepeatable outcomes in the same way that extractors do, but for different reasons. And
Exactly.
so while they might pursue the same color of a product every time, they won't get the same experience from the same color of a product every time. Meanwhile, if we try to pursue the same color every time, we're going to sacrifice the other qualities potentially of the product in pursuit of that. And so, this lack of a shared definition of quality is, not a problem we get to solve today. It's a problem that we all work on together collectively. But I think one thing that we do want you guys to take away from this is that, how we measure this is so important to how we define it. Because a lot of times these definitions, to the wizardry, angle, are without a measurement tool, which is what makes them so untouchable and then unattainable. But if we make sure that everything we're using as a frame of reference is something we can quantify and measure, people love that. And, that's, I think, number one goal.
And from a consumer perspective, color is one of the things that they can measure pretty consistently. And so they know, they have that expectation. And so I think really what we're looking at here is how do we, first of all, understand what are the parameters that create the expectation for the consumer, and then how do we make those parameters repeatable? Because color is one of them, but there's other things that influence the experience, like flavor and texture and things of that nature. So those all add up to what the consumer actually expects. And so how do you actually create repeatable processes that align with those expectations? And that's what allows us to gain the trust, like you were saying, Imran, where they're not feeling like the wool's being pulled over their eyes because all of the parameters that create their expectation of being met.
And we give each other better terminology to have conversations about it when we can measure it and associate it with numbers. Like consumers use THC as a frame of reference because it's a number that they can compare. But we can apply numerical measurements and turn those same, pieces of data into a very complete story just by approaching our process a little bit differently.
Yes, I shared some photos here with Isamar, our handy dandy webinar presenter.
You're always good for some bad weed photos up there,
Yes.
at that research center.
Yes. These ones I picked in particular because the one you've got sort of kind of closer to the center there is actually fresh frozen, but I think you'll notice that there's a particular presence of curled up dead brown leaves. And this is frozen material, so I'm trying to keep this cold. I'm not going to go, sifting through it unless I want to go into the freezer and just spend time like picking through it bit by bit to remove what is like suboptimal material. I don't want it in there. I pulled some of it out of there and ended up with a pile that looks like, what your lawn looks like after you rake it after the winter. It just looks indistinguishable from that.
Perfect. Yeah.
And then the other pile we have there, which honestly, from a COA standpoint, reasonable material, but still fairly broken up, fine particulate, like small pieces, a lot of exposed cells, like the potential for like leaching of chlorophyll and things like that into the resin. So it does produce a darker oil. Now, what are you going to do if it's coming to you like that? Someone says, hey, this is the trim. We need you to extract this. That is what you're given. You're not about to, reverse time and put it back into bud form. You're going to have to extract that. The question is, what am I being asked to make out of it? First of all, like, am I being asked something like that isn't within the realm of possibility? And in that case, someone needs to go over and sort of help them understand, like, hey, listen, like, you were asking me to make this and you're giving me the wrong parts to build it with. This isn't possible. At least on the aspect of, hey, let's do everything by making isolate and reformulating. The chemistry, like I said, on the COA was there, so it was possible to make isolate out of, and we can obviously go down that rabbit hole and talk about the kind of formulations that become possible when you're going into isolate first as opposed to any random resin and modifying from that point of view. But this slide on raw material validation, it's these kind of things, like, hey, listen, if you're going to freeze this, take those leaves off first before you throw it in the freezer. It makes my job way easier. It means there's a lot of nasty compounds, colors that are not going to be present. If I could show the person like one batch made untainted, like with the leaves removed and the other batch made without them removed, and you can say like, hey, I haven't done anything to this, I've run them the exact same, look at the difference between these things. I think it makes a reasonable case, and I think most people, honestly, like extractors, I think understand this. This material isn't something that's being given to me because they made the decision, but it's still something that business owners, operators just might say, hey, screw it, send it all to extraction, we don't care, like just pass it off to those guys, those guys will fix it, or they'll make it good. And yeah, there's a bit of education that it comes along, I think, at that point to save some upset conversations later on down the line.
Yeah. One thing that I want to point out, you mentioned, because I hear this all the time constantly, is that we ran it the exact same. And, the variability in input material, I think everybody is aware of. But then what nobody does is create more than one SOP for extraction based on the variability of their input. And in fact, in most labs, I see that they have basically the same SOP for fresh, frozen, and for dry. And the difference is how much weed fits in the column. They're not changing their solvent temperature. They're not adjusting their evaporation temperature. And what that does is it offloads a lot of your quality control to your filtration and post processing. And so I think everyone agrees variable input is a huge and probably the most significant obstacle in our quality control and quality management systems. So you have to start there. If you are not creating specific SOPs to extract properly different specific input material types, you're starting off at a huge disadvantage. If you have the same solvent exposure time and the same solvent ratio for material that's 2 years old versus 2 months old, best case scenario, you're wasting energy on the good stuff by getting it colder for longer than you need to. And worst case scenario, you're over extracting or under extracting and throwing your product away. So, starting with validating your raw material really does require, in most cases, an adaptive extraction SOP. Don't just lean on that media and, try to filter more or less when you could extract exactly what you're looking for right from the start. And sometimes that comes with the compromise of saying this quality fresh frozen was damaged by a low quality harvesting method and, resetting your expectations from there.
So,
I just
Murphy, what?
Sorry, Adam. I think you're gonna ask the exact same question I might, but I was gonna ask you, so because I'm curious of your opinion of this, but between like a fresh frozen and a dry trim, is there one that you typically will run colder? Because I've always thought about running dry trim slightly colder because of the potential for more like compounds that I want to try and avoid, whereas like fresh frozen, I might be sitting at between -30 and -40, not higher than -30 though. Does that clash a lot with what your thoughts are, or?
Not necessarily, but I would say that your likelihood of extracting chlorophyll has less to do with fresh frozen versus dry and more to do with the age of the material. And so, you can get tons of chlorophyll from fresh frozen, especially if you go from like a cryo freezer to a -30 extraction, because then you actually thaw the material.
Yeah.
And so the key for fresh frozen is for your solvent to be colder than the flour and for the flour to still be frozen when it comes out of the column. The key for dry material is to extract all of it. The biggest mistake I see a lot of people make with their dry material is that because they try to extract so cold, they throw away significant amounts of potential yield because they don't fully extract that material. And so you can either load less in the column or you can increase your temperature, because those are the things that are going to influence your solubility. And so, sometimes that SOP modification is based on the potency of the material. Sometimes it's going to be based on the particle size. For example, one of those flour photos was really finely ground. So something that's really finely ground and has been sitting out is going to need a different level of care than something like fresh frozen, which is broken up very minimally and usually right before it's being extracted, within a day. And so age is probably the most important parameter when it comes to the extraction for me, is how long ago was this harvested? And then the next one is, how has it been stored the whole time? Because the best fresh frozen in the world will not survive your freezer losing power over the weekend. There's no coming back from that seaweed swamp. And so, the storage conditions for really good dry trim could yield just as good a product as some fresh frozen, as long as it was stored properly the whole time. But every time a compromise is made, whether it's at the grow, during harvest, during transport, when it gets to your lab, all of those decisions influence the quality of that material. And so as we go through to validate it, there's a lot that you can measure before extraction to just make sure. So you might sort these out and say, here's what I expect from this material, here's what I expect from this material. That can easily start with potency. But then the next question on the list is, how much moisture content is in it? And that's valid for fresh frozen, which can be 75% moisture or 85% moisture. And that difference is whole percentage points of yield. And so, that extra 10% of water in the plant could be caused by a lot of different things at the grow level. But by the time it gets to you, what's going to matter is how big that range is. And so something that's thawed out and refrozen is going to have, freezer burn and different issues. Any dry material that's been ground up and then sat out is going to take on moisture from the room.
Right.
And so, your control over those storage conditions has a lot of influence over that material remaining in the, qualifying category for an SOP, because dry material with high moisture content is going to extract differently than dry material that is bone dry. And, these are important variables that you can measure quickly, easily. You can use equipment that measures that moisture, or you could just cook it and weigh it before and after. So there's a lot of the tools that I would recommend are sort of based on like, what do you already have? And let's measure it with that, because you don't even need the exact number so much as you need an exact frame of reference for within your lab. If you know that your room is always 40% humidity, and then this material comes in at 20%, if it's open at all, you're adding moisture to it. And conversely, if that material has a lot of moisture and it's open to your air and where it's really dry, you can actually desiccate it. And so, these storage conditions matter just as much for your oil as they do for that flower before you extract it, if not from the moment it's harvested.
It's an interesting one. I remember when you came here, you mentioned like we had some material that was coming out with
I was hassling you.
level on it, and we don't have a temperature controlled shop but if we were ever getting in super sacks of material that were just sitting, you pointed out something that I hadn't thought of at the time, and now obviously we store stuff better. You would hope that people would also be aware of this. I wonder then, if someone says, okay, so my material is more moist, and it's that, or like I'm not certain that I can avoid picking up moisture, and they say, what would be the significant effect, or what's the thing that I would see most as a result of higher moisture content compared to like lower moisture content as a result in my extract? Do you have?
You're gonna have that water's gonna follow you the whole way through. So I wouldn't tolerate that as an excuse. I'd give them the same instructions I gave you guys, which is soak that material and then put it in a freezer for 24 hours before you extract it, and your freezer will desiccate it.
Just salt, yeah.
So you might have environmental conditions that are a problem. Freezing a whole super sack worth of material is not convenient for anybody. But as long as you soak it and freeze it for 24 hours, then you can just one chest freezer at a time, You know, you could do a build out a walk-in, or you can do a buy a Home Depot chest freezer. Either way, desiccate that material until it's under control. You know, you can just take that moisture back out and control for that quality rather than suffering it, because otherwise what you would have to do is make sure that that water stays frozen in exchange for yield and leave some THC behind, or you'd have to filter that water out, so you lean heavily on your filtration, or you'd have to distill that water out, which can lead to incomplete decarbs because you've got stuff that's rapidly boiling and cloudy. And so, you know, there's all these different ways that that water can show up and trouble you. Don't have it. Don't accept that. If it's humid and it's raining, when you get that material in, just freeze it for longer. Dedicate more chest freezers for that. And then, super important follow-up, you're gonna have to defrost those suckers. If you see frost build up on the inside of your chest freezer, it can't desiccate more. There's a limit. And so then you're gonna have to let those thaw out and remove that stanky old water.
I think the other thing too is you got to go up in your supply chain. You've got to set these parameters that are measurable, and you've got to make those expectations clear to your vendors. So whoever you're getting that product from has to know what the acceptance criteria is for receiving it. You've got to be a stickler about it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a true fact, but if I water right, you know, heavily right before I harvest, I get heavier weed in my fresh frozen that I sell to you. So that's
Yeah, so
either a pro tip or horrible news, depending on who you are in that transaction, you know?
right. There's some incentives that are a little misaligned. But
Exactly.
can't that be measured for and controlled for in terms of
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yep. That's where a portable device that can measure it, like you can use infrared devices like the Purple Pro, that is not that great for potency measurement, awesome for moisture content measurement. And so you can measure that in the grow when you go to pick it up, and you can do it again when you get back to your lab, and you can do it again right before you extract. And what's here's another actual piece of pro tip, is that if you just desiccate your weed before you extract it, it'll lose weight. And so then if your bosses are tracking the weight that they received in your inventory management system and you desiccate it and extract it,
Yields, yeah.
yeah, you have different yields. And so your yields might look low, but you're actually extracting less weight than what they're measuring coming in, because they're measuring a whole bunch of water. So it's important for that piece of data to be measured, but then for that piece of data to also be aligned everywhere that it's measured. Because if your yields look low but your quality is good, you know, you might be able to answer for that. Might be too much extra water.
Oh, we got a question from Thomas here about kind of managing processes upstream in the supply chain. He says, what are your thoughts on nitrogen/argon filling fresh frozen material in vac seal bags for storage? I know that using inert gases helps to prevent oxidization and freezer burn in storage, but I've heard that once opened again and exposed to oxygen can cause them to oxidize at a faster rate. Do you think that the extra labor and money of using inert gases in storage is worth the preservation of flavor? And do you have any other suggestions for similar processes?
I mean, if you think about it, right, like just okay, let's say it did oxidize at a faster rate, and honestly, I'm just taking it as a given based on the question. I don't actually know. I can't imagine that, like, unless you had it open after that first opening for like a period of long time, where it would manage to catch up to what it would suffer through not being sealed under inert gas. Like, I have to imagine sealing under inert gas is just a better way to do it. Like,
I mean, if you remove oxygen, you can't oxidize, right? So like it does solve that problem. But then obviously if you open it, now we're just back to oxidation. And so the idea that it would oxidize faster is honestly points more to a water issue once again, because, you know, a lot of those nitrogen and argon filling systems are also, it's dry, you know, anytime that air is in the container, air is nitrogen and oxygen and whatever water and what water is sticking to, you know? And so just removing the water that's in the air in the container is a benefit to you, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in terms of degradation without oxygen that, water is contributing to as well. And so, I would go back to my original statement, which is that the age of the material matters. Okay, you can extend it for longer, but time passes. We're not going to solve that. We can't get younger, and we can't really pause. And so in that way, having the lack of oxygen is going to be really critical for your most susceptible compounds. The terpene content, those are volatiles that you may lose due to a chemical incompatibility with your plastic bag. So now you just need to extract it faster. The best thing you can do is extract as quickly after harvest as possible. The longer that flower sits around being stored, no matter what you store it in, the worse. And, so anything you could do to mitigate harm in between now and then is helpful. But I think consistent temperature in storage and reducing the amount of time that flower is stored are probably the most impactful things that you can do. And, that consistent temperature and lack of container changes is a really hard one, because some products gets touched a lot before it reaches you. So maybe you can only control that from the moment that it comes to your department. But even then, don't be the guy who's cutting open vac bags and sniffing them. Don't be the guy who's opening these containers or cracking jars. Keep it closed as much as you can.
Until the time you're going to extract it, and then extract it immediately once open.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I guess let me go back to this other page real quick, and I want to show you, because we're talking about a lot about that raw material, and container changes and opening things, closing things, whether something's got a little freezer burn or not. These are all little ways that you can have batch variability, but then you can also have a lot of batch variability just in the qualities of the material that you're processing. So, let's assume you've done a perfect job storing it, nitrogen packing it, not opening it too many times, never having your freezer lose power. Then you still have differences from one strain to the next, different, chemical properties of the batch. And all of those then influence the rest of your process. So, on this one, I've got, here we go, 2 different batches of a product being purged at the same temperature, same vacuum, same SOP, but the actual experience of this oil is different from one batch to the next. And so the same SOP is not necessarily going to be applicable to the same batches, because you might not get the same results. And so your goal is for your SOP to look really similar in terms of those actual outputs. And that's where you can validate your specific process. And so, you might have conditions in your lab that are just on the worst end of what's ideal, but you can control it forward from there. And along those lines, you want to measure your products, not necessarily the equipment. When I ask people what temperature their material is for extraction, they will tell me the lowest temperature that their freezer advertises it can reach.
Or what the set point on the chiller is, right?
Set point on your vacuum oven, set point on the chiller. These are not what I asked. I asked how hot was your oil. I asked how cold is your flour. What temperature is your solvent? And these are the parameters that I think are easy to miss, especially when I look at the way that people keep records. So for anyone who's filling out worksheets in the lab, if the thing you write down is also written in the SOP, that's a stupid worksheet. That's not helping anybody. If you write down on your worksheet the temperature that you extracted at, and it says the set point of your chiller, that's not helpful to anybody. If it says the set point of your heater, that's not helpful to anybody. You might want to verify those details, but those should be pre-printed on your form, and you can say yes, no, what you want to be recording on paper in these notes is the context. It was rainy and there was so much humidity in the room that day. You know, things like that need to be written down on your paper log. Um, you know, things like having a tour and having a ton of people come in and look at all your product and a bunch of investors stand around and open all your jars. That's helpful to have written down on my paper logs. Your paper log should not say that the oven set point was 110. That's not helpful. I want to know how hot the oil was. You know, I want to know what the actual vacuum level was, and not that you vacuumed it for 8 hours. Vacuumed for 8 hours means nothing to me. Vacuumed how deep, you know, vacuumed at what temperature, you know?
I was just thinking about something, Murphy. Although I think it's still an argument to make for saying like what you did set the oven to, because if you notice like a significant discrepancy between like that set point and what your oil actually measures, maybe you discover that like your oven is not functioning as intended.
Sure, but the set point is the SOP, so that shouldn't change.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And so that's where I'm saying that worksheet should say what it's supposed to be, and you say what it was.
Gotcha.
If you write down what it was supposed to be, that is similarly unhelpful.
Yeah.
I want to know what it actually was.
Yeah.
That's why, you know, a meat thermometer doesn't have to communicate with your oven. It tells you what temperature the meat is. And then you can cook your turkey at whatever temperature for however long until that meat thermometer pops, right? Because what we care about is the product. I don't care what you have to set your oven to. I care if your oil ever gets hotter. And so in the example on this slide, I've got 2 batches of the same material. The blue column is what the SOP says. The SOP says there should be 5 ppm of residuals, no more, that we've got, you know, 6 hours of processing max. The temperature is consistently set, and the vacuum level should be ending at the same baseline that it started at. And for one batch, the vacuum worked out pretty well, but it had to get hotter than what was recommended. And for the third batch, it had to get even hotter. And, you know, we can use the same amount of time, which is usually pretty easy for people to follow, but then the residual ppms, the output of that product, was wildly different. And so for something that had to get hotter, the same amount of time was not good enough. For something that had a lot more volatility in it, you know, we had to consider that in our vacuum level. And so the more you can measure, the easier it will be for you to work backwards and search for a root cause. Because if the SOP said for you to set your vacuum to 40C for 6 hours and pull full vacuum for whatever your pump is, the people did what they were supposed to do. And if your SOP was to establish a baseline where, you know, going back to this one, this is vapor pressure down here. We have where the oil started, what it got up to when we warmed it up. These are the same batches from both slides. So as we warm it up, we see way more vapor pressure. And the key here is that they're done when they go all the way down. And so if we can't get it all the way down, then that wouldn't be good. And all of these little spikes are events where something was actually evaporating off. And so for one batch to have the same spike as another is really helpful here, because now I can see this is where we lost our butane. And over here, I was losing other volatiles the whole way along. But I'm always going to lose my butane right in that one area. And so the more I measure, now the more I can validate a process. And that validation should be specific to the product. So there may be variability in the time, but not the temperature. And that's how I preserve my terpenes. Maybe there's variability in the vacuum depth, which is going to influence how much time I expose it to that deep vacuum. This is all going to be hardware specific, which is where, going back to our extraction and raw material validation, maybe you have 6 by 24 inch columns. You can't fit very much material in there. Can't fit very much solvent in there. Maybe they're not jacketed, so you can't retain the same temperature from the first run of the day to the 5th run of the day because it starts frosting over. If you know what those inherent variables are, then you can start working backwards to control everything else. And so if you have columns that aren't jacketed. Maybe you want an injection coil to make sure it's always cold going in. Maybe you need the ability to warm them back up again or alternate between columns so that they don't frost over so completely. So you can always adapt an SOP to whatever variables are present, whether the variables are in your hardware and you can't overcome them, the variables are in the material and you have to work around them, or the variables are environmental and you have to compensate for the other two. And so, whatever obstacle you're up against, the key is for you to measure enough parameters that you could go back and figure out what was the difference between these two batches. Why would they have such different reactions to the same SOP? And, ultimately, two different reactions to the same SOP indicates that it was the wrong SOP for at least one of those batches. And so now you can figure out how you make a better decision next time. So one of the most important things you can do is measure all of this data for the stuff that works out exactly the way you want it to. Tell me why, when it's good, it was good. Measure what you did right when you do it right. People pay a really close attention to the things that went poorly. They don't pay a lot of attention to when it accidentally turns out awesome. But that's the map we want to follow. What happened when it worked perfectly?
I've got a question for you, Murphy.
Sure.
Which I've really been enjoying the way you've been presenting this. But now part of my brain is going a little bit and is coming up with this question, which says, so as I understand it, we want to, create SOPs for, different types of material, whether it's moisture content, the age of the material. Obviously, like, you try and control as best as you can, but you're going to get different batches of material one way or the other. Yep. There's not much you can do to stop that. And I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, you say let's create SOPs for ranges of different types of material that come in, so that, like, our outputs stay consistent or reasonably consistent regardless of what we get in. Where my brain is going with this is asking, just how many SOPs does one need to create? Because I'm imagining there's quite a range of factors, moisture content, potency, age,
right.
Like frozen, not frozen, ground up, not ground up. Forgive me, but I wonder, like, someone might say, is this an endless task? When could someone say I have reasonably?
It could be endless. It depends. What it really centers on is you need an SOP for every compromise you're willing to make. And so sometimes those compromises happen before the flower ever enters the lab. And we say, we're just not going to process flower of this variable nature because it does not align with the compromises we're willing to make downstream. When I look at, like, the two examples of flower we had in those slides, I might tolerate that fresh frozen and just know that I'm going to get a lower yield than I want, because part of the weight is brown flower that has no yield to contribute. It's just, fan leaf. And I'm going to need to have less exposure time and essentially under extract that material, because if I pursue complete extraction, it's going to come with added filtration burden.
Right.
Now, maybe I have a whole skid just for filtration, and it's awesome because I work in the R&D facility with all the stainless in the world, and I can, just go get a sintered disc and, swap it out. Or maybe I have a huge budget for media and I have tons of different types of media and time in the day. Right. So maybe I'll do 100% extraction and then I'll have to address it through filtration. That becomes a very personal question. And so while I think it is limitless, the number of SOPs that could exist in the world, I think for your lab, it comes down to, what are your limitations and the compromises you can make? Is flour so expensive where you are and so hard to obtain because it's New Jersey and all the weed is bad? Or is it so abundant and available because this is Oregon and it's everywhere and the price is low that it doesn't really matter? Can you tolerate more time in the booth, taking up space, in that on your extractor to do additional filtration, or a rinse and repeat on your crystallization? Or do you have such backlog of flower that you just need to get through it? So maybe you sacrifice initial extraction yield to limit filtration. Maybe you maximize initial extraction yield and then compromise for having to potentially do additional filtration or additional rinses for that crystallization. You have to choose that, I think, is really the goal here. It's not to avoid it, it's to choose it. Which problem do you want to face? Do you want to risk throwing away 5%, from that 20% potency dry material so that you don't have to do CRC? Great. And if you're not willing to lose that 5%, now you have to invest in CRC. And so this, becomes really just a question of which compromises are you willing to make and which resources are abundant to you. Do you have more hardware, more time, more hours, more grams? Is it more important to turn over the batch quickly because you're sold out? Or is it more important to process quickly because your freezers are full? Like, everyone's lab is going to have a different set of obstacles and variables. Sometimes you're in a position to go buy an additional solvent tank so that you can have 2 different gas blends. Sometimes you're not. And so then you have to address it through temperature and time. It really depends on which compromises you're prepared and capable of making and tolerating as a business, which, going back to that list of stakeholders, let's assume every decision you make is compliant so the regulators are happy, and let's just assume every decision you make makes a good product that consumers want to buy. Now it's a conversation everyone in the lab has about what's it going to cost, and what are we not going to be able to do when we make this decision. If we are going to have a lower yield, do we need to charge more when we sell it? If we're going to have a faster turnaround, does that mean that we need to buy more material and increase our throughput? That's a holistic decision-making process that travels across every spreadsheet in the lab, and these are not one-size-fits-all questions by any means.
Yeah, that's because that's where my head was going. I was just, because for myself anyway, I can get away with a lot of things because I'm not like, I'll say that my approach to this, we'll say topic or subject questions, is somewhat, I feel like, a bit of a cheat sheet. Sometimes I just say, look, I'm just going to precipitate out THCA and I'm going to work with dealing with these problems in my own particular way.
Yeah, because you don't have to do it in individual jars at a time like some people who are probably watching this,
Yeah.
That's,
so
you
it's
come into that advantage.
Yeah. So it's and so the thought of getting super controlly, while I understand it and appreciate it, I often find I can cheat my way through some of these things. Not all of them. Some of these rules still apply to me, don't get me wrong, but some of them I find that I can be a little bit more forgiven on because I have this effectively this way of just getting rid of some of the problems. I separate things and then reformulate and can play around a little in a different way for some others. But so that's why I had to ask that question.
So just to be a little more clear about what you're saying there, Imran, we're talking about the genome crystallization technology and really looking at it as a way to simplify this down. Because yeah, you could end up with 20 different SOPs, but maybe you can take on more variability while also simplifying the number of different processes that you have by implementing crystallization technology. Upstream in your, looking at what biomass you can actually process effectively into isolate can be expanded. But then also, even if, let's say you're making a textured product and you have a specific extraction process, very tight parameters in terms of what sort of biomass you can accept, very good control of your environment, you are likely to still end up with product that doesn't meet your end specification. And so having another additional process that you can then recycle that into isolate gives you, it limits how many different processes you're actually going to require. And so it can be very, very beneficial to try to keep things simple in the lab, because you don't want to end up with just an infinite number of SOPs. And you know what happens when there's 20 SOPs is that they're all out of date, and
Yeah.
and
No
people
one's read
aren't
them.
being trained. No one's read them. And
Yeah.
so you do want to keep things simple, right? And I think that that's really one of the things that we aim for with our clients, is to help them simplify these problems, make repeatable extracts, using the crystallization technology to separate and break down the constituents of the extracts into ingredients when possible, and allowing the extractors to then reformulate when possible back into a consistent formula. And I think that's a really important tool for a lab to have, to be able to make repeatable extracts, with high quality, along with all of the parameters upstream that Murphy's already mentioned.
Yeah, I think an important part of repeatability is to make sure that your process is predictive rather than reactive. It's nice to have good reaction plans, good rework plans where
Yeah.
you can redissolve and fix, but it's nicer to not have to. And so, as a business owner, I want both. I want protection. I want to do good work and have insurance, right? But then
Exactly.
as the laboratory personnel, someone's going to be telling me to extract more socks in a day. Someone's going to be telling me to get yields up. And, if I've got all these different goals, everyone's got to kind of have the same mindset in terms of which area they want to target first. If your goal is increase yields, you can do that through more socks per day, or you can do that through more efficient extraction and getting more off of the material you've already got. And it's important to measure those steps as you go. And similarly, even in just thinking about your crystallization, Todd just asked, some people do it in 20 minutes, some people do it in 3 hours. That has so much to do with everything that happened before crystallization.
Yeah.
The way that you get a 20-minute crystallization is to do a perfect extraction and a perfect filtration, and crystallization happens to you. You just leave and come back, you don't have to do anything. And when you have to work at it, that either implies compromises were made ahead in that process, and over extraction occurred, under filtration occurred, and then crystallization has to pick it up. And so, every time you don't control quality, the next stage of that process has to carry that burden over. And so now, looking one lab at a time, maybe you can't afford to buy a crystallizer, so you're doing this in jars. So now you need to go back and look at, how can I improve my extraction and my filtration so that crystallization doesn't carry any of the quality burden. Maybe you don't have the budget to be spending tons of money on media. Then you're going to want to target it from your extraction end and not over extract anything, and you compromise on that initial extraction efficiency. It's all about knowing when and where that compromise is going to occur, because a compromise will be made. Otherwise, you just have grown perfect weed and everything's working out for you, and you're probably not in this webinar. You're probably chilling, So, but for the rest of us, we have to look one step at a time and decide, do I have a chiller that gets too hot halfway through the day? Do I have a heater that can't keep up? Do I have obstacles that I can't overcome? And then I compensate for them. If you have excellent thermal control and you can heat up and cool down really quickly, like Imran, then you can recrystallize as many times as you want and play around. And if you have to wait overnight for that to happen every single time, then you don't get to do as many experiments, and you don't get to have as many rework opportunities. Yeah. And so
no mulligans for a lot of us.
Yeah, exactly. And so for some of us, it's fine to get it wrong and then fix it. And for some of us, we have a backlog and more material showing up. We can't compromise on that, because time is our limited resource. So, it becomes a really important question, especially if you're sitting there in a moment where you're saying, I can't afford an agitator right now. And what I would always ask anyone in that position is invest in the chillers first, invest in the heaters first, because that'll improve your process in all these other ways that will help make you more money. And then you will be able to afford an agitator, because an agitator will still go faster, but not without the temperature control that comes ahead of that. And so maybe you can't revamp the whole process, but as long as you know which direction you're going, you can start piecing and, climbing a ladder towards it at least. Because what
There
you
is
don't want
also a
is to completely pivot 180.
there is also a trick to kind of creating some circulation. And if you have at least the ability to warm your collection vessel, you can circulate it using pulling vapor from the top and pushing it to the bottom of the collection vessel will create a little bit of agitation in there. So that is also a trick, but you do need to have temperature control over that, both heating and cooling.
And
Yeah.
I was also going to say that just Murphy, one of the things you mentioned there is about how everything that comes before crystallization does have an impact. And I had mentioned like how I can get away from some things, but that's one of the things I can't get away from. Like more contamination in my resin does impact my crystallization. It slows it down.
Mm-hmm.
So real fun is to recrystallize isolate because it happens so quickly that it's actually kind of hard to work with. I'm more used to crystallizing out of resins than I am with isolate. So every time I recrash isolate, it's almost problematic because it's happening so quickly. Like it's just a bit of a jolt because I have to be like, hold on.
Everyone feels so bad for you right now.
But yeah, Todd asks, he says, from 20 minutes to 3 hours, what are the benefits and downfalls of each? So in this case, I think he's referring to specifically fast like precipitation because there are longer crystallization times on the order of like weeks where you're like slowly growing diamonds, but I don't think that's what he's referring to. The benefit of going faster is that you're done faster. Like if you can go faster, you pretty much just always would. But the real question is like how do you know that you've completed your process? And that's usually like, have you gotten down to the temperature that you intend to finish at, and have you let it like sit at specific temperatures along the way to make sure that it's actually going through the process and you're not just like rushing down to a cold temperature. If you go there is such a thing as going too cold too fast, where you like you don't allow the crystals to actually, they don't have a chance to form, or you go so cold so fast that you produce such tiny we'll call them crystals, that they are basically uncatchable, that like you lose a lot of them even through some fine filtration. So uh, but that's my answer to benefits and downfalls, if I
Yeah.
can condense it
And
into a short
I was
answer.
teasing you, but it is truly the worst when it clogs, which is the most common outcome of crashing too quickly. And so I think, whether it takes you 20 minutes or 3 hours matters less than whether you were in control of that. Were you expecting it to take 20 minutes when it took 20 minutes? Or were you expecting it to take an hour? And now it is going to take an hour because it's going to be very hard for you to unclog it. And you'll actually have to warm it up and redissolve it to get it back out again.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times the way we describe our process is incomplete in that sense, that if it took you 20 minutes to crash, but it takes you 40 minutes to get it out of the extractor, that's not actually helpful to you. What you might want is to take, 30 minutes to crash and not crash all the way so that you can still pour it in a liquid out of that, spout. Like that SOP really is very importantly specific to your hardware, specific to your conditions, specific to the container you want to put it in next. And that's all aside from, what do I want my sugar to look like? Am I going to make this into shatter or not? Is this going straight to vapes or not? Is this a batch of 1,500 grams or 15,000 grams? There's so many variables that are separate from what products that I want to make, that are so specific to your lab. And, this is a big issue in a lot of MSOs is they want everyone to have the same SOP. What you can have is the same quality parameters for the product.
Right.
You can't have the same SOP to get there. That's silly. Even Hamburger Helper knows that. Even DiGiorno Pizza knows that. They'll tell you, you know, ovens range. You're going to have this variable. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. And so you do need a good collection of SOPs that are specific to your hardware, to your process individually, because the reasons why you might speed something up or slow it down, you should be able to justify with actual conditions in your lab that you're measuring.
Murphy, do you think that speaking about the MSO challenge, which is just basically every state that you operate in, you want to make consistent products. You're operating in different states with different growers, and you don't have one consistent supply of biomass input. But do you think that just kind of separating into isolate and terp sauce at least gives you more control of those variables where you can then reformulate, let's say specifically like vapes, I think is a big, vapes and infused pre-rolls being like a huge segment of like the consumer demand. And being able to break it down into like what are the actual raw ingredients. Like there's bakery brands that span multiple countries, and they have consistent ingredients, and the result of what they produce is fairly consistent.
Yeah, so I think what you can have is a consistency across your product quality on the output end. And then we're just all accepting that there's going to be variability on that input. And so sometimes the variability is what you're willing to buy, what you're willing to process. Maybe you're in a state where high quality flour is less available, so you work with fewer people and you just do less business. An MSO doesn't make that compromise, right? And so what they have to compromise on is that they're going to be more willing to take in a broader range of material, which then comes with a downstream compromise of less of that material, and what it results in when you extract it is going to make it out as products. And so, in a lot of other industries, it would be, essentially the waste per batch, right? And so if this was agriculture, you might just have like the outside edges, and a certain percentage of your harvest isn't going to the farm stand. There's a certain amount of tomatoes that are never going to be sold on the vine. Those are going into sauce. And so, you might have to tolerate that loss somewhere else in that process rather than on the incoming material side. You might also, knowing that there's that variable input material, invest more heavily in your equipment. A lot of times when people think of automation, they think of it in terms of making everything function the same. But what real automation could do is more along the lines of what we think of AI for, right? What it should actually do is be adaptive. And so one angle of automation is to, control and link up all of your thermometers so that you can see what temperature everything is. Another version of automation is for the thermometers to speak with the heaters and speak with the chillers and increase or decrease their set points in relation to the temperature that they're taking. And so the more you invest in controlling that temperature rather than monitoring it, the more you could influence those decisions downstream. And so that way your product never overheats, or your product is always extracting warm enough to capture everything, or your saturation isn't ever exceeding a certain point and now clogging up the whole system, because downtime hurts us more than anything else. So where you make those compromises is, I think, where a lot of MSOs, they want standardization across everything. But the truth is they might need literally different equipment to produce the same product in different locations based on that variable input. If I'm extracting bigger batches versus smaller batches, I want different sizes of equipment. You can't run that big reactor with a tiny amount of isolate. It's not going to work. And so, you can make the same quality of diamond with a big reactor, or with a little minor, or with a jar. And the question now becomes batch size. And so, for the MSOs to have a standard quality requires flexibility on the other end. Like you mentioned, there's bakeries all over the world. I doubt that any of them have identical manufacturing equipment inside those bakeries. I bet that they all have different brands and types of ovens. I bet that they all have different brands and types of mixing equipment, because their measurement for those parameters is based on the product that they're making. And maybe it has to be adjusted for this big auger that's fully automated and connected to a conveyor belt. And maybe they mix longer when it's like a person with a sack that's dumping the flour in, but their product control, their quality control on that output should be really based almost entirely on the parameters of that product that they want to follow. And so what an MSO tends to do is invest in like a infrastructure template, when what they really want to invest in instead is a measurement template of what are the critical control points that we measure, where do we measure them, how do we measure them, when do we measure them, and then we make that feedback match so that if, when, and where you measure it is the same product quality each time, then you know that you've created a repeatable process. And that could be a giant extraction system and 2 big crystallizers, and that could be 1 4-column skid, small little recovery, and you use miners. It could be as variable as those inputs, as long as you make the same measurements every single step through. And I think that's where the crystallization world gets very convoluted when you read online, because I cannot tell you how often people are reporting their chiller set point. If you don't have a thermocouple in the solution, touching the solution, then you're just telling me nonsense. I need to know what temperature the solution is, and not the extra data, because that extra data doesn't translate. But if we all measure exactly the solution temperature, then we could all recreate each other's SOPs theoretically. And that's our biggest obstacle. And so whatever your SOP is, you've got to have tools for measuring that. They could be very low tech or very high tech. They could require human intervention, or they could be automated. But the key is how you measure it, when you measure it. And that part can be repeatable for sure. So I've got kind of a sample audit. We made this prettier because my version when I go in the lab is usually a lot more text than this. But I think for any product that you make, what you can do is really identify what's important to you about that product, how you classify it, whether, that's going to be color, consistency, texture, format, particle size. You want to define all of those details, from potency to, crystal size to terpene content. And through identifying what makes it good, you've got to write out that list of what makes it bad. And what makes it bad can be a lot bigger of a list that a lot of times doesn't get addressed, especially by the time the product is finished. And so the more you can go work backwards on why a product didn't turn out well, the more capable you'll be, first of all, of fixing that product, but also preventing that outcome in the future. And so in a perfect world, the more audits like this you do, the more pointless they'll become, because you never run into any of these other issues down here. And that's how you know you've made it, is when I sound crazy for making you check, because it's always perfect. And so, when you're looking at how to audit your process, you want that audit trail to always go back to the day that flour showed up in your facility. If you can't tell me everything that happened to that batch, like, when the state asks for seed to sale tracking, they want to know where the weed is at. When I ask you for seed to sale tracking, I want to know what you did to that weed. I want to know where it's at physically in terms of time, temperature, container, who touched it, how many people touched it, how many times did it get open, what volume was it stored in, did you bring in fresh material that you just harvested yesterday into a freezer where there was material that had been frozen for a week already? I want to know all those details as I work my way backwards, because the source of a non-conforming product is almost always several stages backwards in the process. And the shorter you can make that trail, the better. But, on that MSO front, a lot of times what they do is they really focus on what is good, and then they don't have a long list of solutions for how to fix it along the way. And then you just end up with big finished batches of goo. And I got to tell you, by the time you've taken it out of your extractor and put it in a jar, we're worse off for trying to fix it. We want to fix that product, before it ever comes out of the extractor if we can.
Murphy, where in the process are you doing the sample quality audit? Can you walk us through kind of what you're sampling, when, and how?
Yeah, so I would do this in the flower right when it shows up by pulling different samples of it, checking the potency, checking the moisture, checking the trichome coverage with a microscope. I would do this during extraction. So when you pull a sock out, pull samples from the bottom of the sock, the top of the sock, the middle of the sock, send those out for the same test: potency, uh, you know, residual moisture, terpene content. And that'll tell you how efficient that initial extraction is. And that'll tell you where in your extraction that efficiency is going wrong, because depending on if the potency that's residual in that sock is consistent from the top to the bottom versus concentrated at the bottom and pretty well extracted at the top, that'll tell me a lot about where in your process something is going wrong. And so, that's like our column efficiency over here. Then I would look at your temperature control. And so we're going to see D9 conversion when processes run really hot. And that's something that's really common when people stack batches on top of each other. And so their collection vessel gets really, really hot towards the end of recovery multiple times throughout the day, rather than maintaining a pretty consistent temperature and then that oil being set free and allowed to cool. And you're also going to see that in a lot of the post processing. So back to my graphs on that vacuum purging. If we evacuate the solvent really quickly, the same amount of heat is actually heating the oil up. And if there's a lot of solvent remaining, the same amount of heat is not actually getting anything hot because that solvent's boiling and cooling it down. And so seeing isomerization or changes in that chemical profile tell me a lot about if I'm losing control of my temperature once I start heating things up. Similarly, if my residual solvents are high, maybe I'm doing a set it and forget it type of temperature control. So I never changed my set point, and then I just end up with wildly random residual solvent quantities, because the same temperature over the same amount of time is not necessarily going to evaporate entirely different quantities of solvent. And so, these samples I've got to take before a process starts, during a process, and after. And that's to validate the process before you even write an SOP. And then you're going to want to take these samples again anytime you change the SOP, anytime you train someone, anytime there's variable output at the end, and any other time you can get away with it, I would say, because the more you test these processes before, during, and after, the tighter they're going to get, and the less variable the output immediately afterwards would be. And so a lot of times when we're evaluating our product quality, we only do it at the very end. But if we did it in between each step of the process, we would not have to do the extra steps only to start over again. Like one of the key things about using a reactor is that second reactor to send solution over to, so that I can send it back. Like those extra vessels go a really long way. And if you don't have extra vessels to redissolve, now you have to tighten things up so much that redissolve is never a requirement in your SOP. So the more you can test it, the more you can literally over time remove steps from the process and shorten it up, which is my favorite thing, because then it is harder to make a mistake. The more steps someone can take, the worse.
And guys, we're also considering maybe even offering a service for a sample quality audit. If that sounds like a good service that you guys would be interested in, give us that feedback. Just type audit into the question box so that we can gauge how popular something like that might be.
Yeah.
Crystallization and temperature control. I think this is where we can really like. I think you mentioned earlier, Murphy, like you want to make sure that you're not relying on your insurance policy, but it is really helpful in the lab to have an insurance policy if something goes wrong in your process to be able to reprocess it, and also to have a lot of variability in how much you can actually, how many different types of extractions you can, or how many different types of variants of biomass you're actually able to process into a consistent, repeatable end product. Having extra tools in your lab like crystallization really enables the ability to control those variables in a different way and reformulate into consistent end products where you're really just measuring the consistency of that end product, and you have the ability to actually use, let's say, consistent ingredients. THC isolate, you can get it to 99% pure repeatably, very, very repeatably. Same thing with terp sauce. There's more variability in the terp sauce than the isolate because the isolate is one compound, and it can be produced at a 99% purity, very, highly consistently. But also having that separated terp sauce, it's not going to be quite as consistent as the isolate, but it also, it's an additional, it gives you more consistency, or it takes you in a step towards higher levels of repeatability and consistency. And you can actually, it's a measurement point. You have this terp sauce, and you can actually assess the qualities of that terp sauce before making a formulation, and that improves repeatability as well.
Yeah, it gives you the opportunity to make a decision in your product formulation rather than just having it happen to you. So if you're not actively crystallizing, you're still impacted by crystallization. You're just not in control of it. And a lot of times the difference between very dry batter versus very wet batter has a lot to do with the ratio of crystalline compound versus not crystallized products in there. And that's a ratio that you can now contribute to and have control over through crystallization rather than it just occurring. So I think everyone experiences it. They just aren't always in control of it, which is really the obstacle from a quality perspective. Getting isolate is easy, but isolate's not usually the product we want to make. What it is an ingredient of the product that we want to make. And so it becomes, an ingredient contributing to a new process of, instead of just mixing up whatever you have, mixing what you want and mixing them together at a controlled ratio. And for some batches, that means you're going to have leftover isolate. And for some batches, that means you're going to have leftover terp sauce. And when that happens, take good care of those plants because they're the good ones. But for the rest of them, now we have a byproduct of that extra isolate that is now a useful byproduct instead of waste of a whole batch that came out too dry and had to sell for less.
I was just going to mention one other thing, which is, you don't have to go back to the previous slide, but I'll just, off of memory, with respect to like crystallization and the subject of repeatable outcomes, there are a couple things that do sort of tend to matter, and how we measure them. I think I've worked on, when I was listening to Murphy talk about the little ways that she comes up with measuring different things, and how she tries to create different ways based on what people have access to in instrumentation. I realize I've kind of done the same thing because we don't always have like infinite money to spend on like the most expensive equipment. So for example, like, because concentration matters when you're doing crystallization, there's very fancy ways of detecting concentration. There's also simply pouring out a quantity of your solution, weighing it immediately, and then weighing it after it evaporates, and seeing like more or less what the solid portion, like what the dissolved portion was with respect to your solution. And then you can say, well, hey, if this is what was dissolved in this much, and I know my level was this much, then my concentration of that solution is about say 1 to 1 or 5 to 1 or whatever it ends up being. And you can then therefore do like the same trial over and over at different concentrations to see how it affects your yield, how it affects your particle size, how it affects your separation of like color compound. Like all of these things are doable even at a fairly we'll call it like rudimentary level before you even get to like expensive fancy detectors. Just wanted to throw that in there for anyone that might be curious.
Yeah, and even the fancy detectors are only as good as the context you use them in. So something as simple as weighing your product plus the context that you have for that process goes a really long way. And I think a lot of people do this without recognizing it. Like everyone probably has like a spot inside their collection vessel that like when things boil down to that spot, that's how they know.
Yeah.
Right? Like I can't even explain it better than that, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. And so it's like that gasket line or like halfway in between this, area. Like we look for that spot. And when I shine my flashlight, I'm always looking there. And so, we all kind of have a way that we measure that. And all we're talking about is now adding a number to that. Like imagine if inside that collection vessel we had measurement markings where if we know the volume of solvent that's going in and we know the volume of oil that's going in, we could determine our concentration visually just by creating a number rather than a remembered spot on the sidewall that we're using to evaluate that. So it might not even be changing your process from what you do currently, but just adding a numerical value to the way that you do it currently so that now you can repeat it. Because if I say I boil it down to just above that gasket could mean very different things to me versus Adam versus Imran. And so if now that was a line that said 8 on it, we boil to 8, and we recover it down to that fixed spot. And so anytime we can add a number, we can get rid of some of that variability that comes from a lack of very clear and objective measurements. Anytime we remove subjectivity from that process, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to change our process, but just that we can measure it and communicate it more clearly.
Yeah, because like think about it, right? Like a new person starts and you just want to use clear language to explain to them what it is you're
Right.
trying to do.
Yeah, this goes back to the noobs. How is a noob going to know what I mean when I say boil it down to just above the gasket? That might be what I do. That might be true. But how do they understand that? They shouldn't have to. We could, we could identify that much more clearly. And so whether we do that with a scale, whether the whole system is on a load cell, so I can literally do addition and subtraction to figure it out, you don't have to change your process entirely, but just the way you communicate about it is greatly impacted by the way that you measure it. And it's much easier to achieve a number than it is to achieve a vague description.
Yeah.
So we've been talking for so long, you guys, but I definitely want to leave time to answer questions from people. And I think, the real world problems is the key value here. I get people sending me pictures of their product and saying, something went wrong. And I always have to respond to them with more questions to figure out why it went wrong or what they were trying to achieve. And the method of how you identify a root cause issue and how you solve for it, again, is going to be different for everybody based on your constraints. But I think the approach should really be the same every single time. And like I said, you should trace that product all the way back to the second that flower came into the building. And anywhere where things never changed is great because we can cross those off and identify them as the issues. And then anywhere where the process did change now becomes a new opportunity to measure better. You don't have to add expensive thermocouples everywhere, but if you can test one everywhere and look for which ones have the most variability, then you can invest more in those areas of your process that are weak. And that's where, crystallization can be a huge advantage because it's a relatively low cost overall compared to some of the things that people invest in all the time. You don't need 14 vacuum ovens if you can purge in 4 hours. You just need to turn over that product faster. And so, where you spend your money has a lot to do with where you can measure and how you can approach those types of questions.
I answered some of the questions that people are asking kind of as we were going, just because I wasn't sure how long we were going to go, and I worried a little bit that some people might have left. But someone was asking essentially how they can improve their condensing capacity if they don't have the ability to just throw a bunch of money at the problem. And I was asking, like, essentially, what is their method of condensing their gas at the moment, because my mind was going to increasing surface area to make it like give
Sure.
them contact between their gas and whatever it is that they're using to cool it down. At the moment, it seems like they're using a chiller which may only get down to 5 Celsius, which has me wondering, like, are they even returning as a liquid into their solvent tank, or is it like it might still be like just gas when it gets there? And if that's the case, then they're really relying on like the chilling that's in their solvent tank, and that can take a long time. That I know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to challenge you there still to go all the way back to the start of the process and say, how cold are you starting? Because the colder you start your extraction, the more heat you need
Mm.
to then evaporate, and the hotter you're evaporating, the colder you need to be to condense again. And so you can solve a lot of that by finding the optimal extraction temperature that doesn't require you to just go -80 out the gate. A lot of people over chill for their original extraction, in my opinion, because they want to protect that flower. But the best thing you can do for protecting the flower and not over extracting it is to get it out of the column quickly. And so you can extract relatively warm. Butane and propane are never warm, but you can extract pretty warm by just extracting faster. And so, lower exposure time at warmer temperatures can give you the same result as longer exposure time at colder temperatures. And, sometimes that's just a difference of loading less in the column so you can clear it faster. There's a
So we also
lot to be said about not overpacking. Oh, go
we
ahead,
also
Adam.
have a oh yeah, we also have a tool that could be useful. It's called a regenerator, and it takes the vapor off of your coming off of your boiling vessel or your collection vessel, and it passes that vapor across the liquid coming in from your extraction columns. So the vapor is warm, the liquid coming from your extraction is cold, and it just exchanges the heat between the two. So it doesn't require any additional electricity or any additional chilling, but it does heat up the liquid before it gets to your collection vessel, and it cools down the vapor coming off of your collection vessel at the same time with no additional energy. So that's something you might want to look at.
Yeah, I always try to conceptualize these for people as you're just removing a heat load rather than trying to actively cool something. And so think about, like, on a hot day, it'd be great to stand in front of the air conditioner, but if you don't have an air conditioner, a fan still helps, right? And if you had a fan and an air conditioner, that's the most comfortable you'll ever be. And so, anytime that you have like that simple extra step in the middle, you can close the gap, because to go from one extreme to the other is much harder for any equipment. And the solution, if you had all the money in the world, would not be to get the coldest chiller and the hottest heater. It would be to have as consistent of a temperature from start to finish as possible, and not to go from huge extremes.
Are there any
Let's see.
other
Oh,
questions before we wrap this? Oh yeah, question for Murphy. We
yeah. All
have some
right.
dried flowers stored for a year. Are these flowers still qualified to be extracted for THC vape pens?
I mean, I'll let you guess what I want to ask, but how'd you store them? Stored where? How hot? In what kind of container? How old was it when you got it and stored it for a year? I think you can store things for a very long time under perfect conditions, and you can ruin things in a very short amount of time under poor conditions. So if it's been exposed to humidity, if it hasn't been airtight, if it has adapted to take the shape of the container that it's in, if you can imagine it that way, the the quality of that storage has a lot to do with it. And so, one thing that's always valuable is just run another potency test, because a lot of times the potency test that material is sold with is from right after its harvest rather than how it is right now today. And along with that potency test, request that moisture test or conduct one yourself. As long as the moisture hasn't fluctuated massively and the temperature hasn't fluctuated massively, it's good for quite a while. And the more fluctuation you have in temperature and in moisture, which often go together, the worse it will be. And in either case, I think it's going to be valuable to limit your exposure time with older material. You can always put weed back in the column and extract it more. It's very hard to do the opposite and much less satisfying, So, limiting that exposure time, you can aim for colder extraction conditions, but I do think the faster you can get weed out of the column after extraction, the better. If you leave your weed in there until you're done with your solvent recovery, worse things are happening. So, getting it in and getting it back out again is going to be hugely valuable. And especially if you have a lot of that old weed that's been sitting, it's okay to do one column, test the sock before extraction and after extraction, and take a look at that oil. There's so much value in doing a quick quality control run. And then you can just find out before you schedule yourself for a week of bad times. Because usually we save it up till we're desperate. And that's the worst time to have to do it.
Murphy, I don't know if you mentioned this. I assume you did, but I'm going to throw it in there. If you've held on to something for a year and your COA is a year old, like definitely retest it to make sure that like, because I don't know how many COAs that I've looked at material that I might be interested in purchasing, and the COA is over a year old, and like I may not know their storage conditions, or I simply don't trust them if they tell me their storage conditions, and so I'm not going to buy that without a much more updated COA to tell me like the chemical nature of that thing, especially if I'm interested in producing isolate.
But I mean, to that end, I've got some weed in the jar that I'm looking at right now in my kitchen. This has got to be 2024 weed at best. It might be end of 2023 weed, and it's still the most fire weed in my house. Like it's still my favorite OG from my homie, and I only roll it up on special occasions. And so the age of it is relevant, because if I had a fresh batch of that, I'd be happier. But otherwise, it's in my amber jar. It's in my best jar. I keep it the nicest. I would never leave it in my car. Like I treat that old weed carefully because I care about it so much. And so, that storage is as important, I think, as the age. And then the older it is, even if you can't do anything about the fact that time has passed, it's like sunscreen, right? Like it'd be great if you wore it when you're younger, but that's no reason to stop now. So take as good a care of it as you can going forward.
Awesome, guys. Well, if there's no more questions, I think we should probably wrap here. Oh, I guess there's one more question, then we'll probably have to wrap it up after this. It says, Thomas says, you're speaking over not overpacking socks and not getting all the THCA. We have a 6-inch diameter, 3-foot tall. We use 1,800 for cured and 3,000 for mesh frozen. What would you consider overpacking?
So it's a great question, and the answer to this will be the same for everyone. You got to test that sock after extraction. Bottom sample, middle sample, top sample. And if there's residual, it should be evenly distributed. If it's not evenly distributed, it's overpacked no matter what. And then if there is a lot of residual that's evenly distributed, then it's a parameter issue, and you may need to pack less because you have short extraction columns, or you may need to extract a little warmer because it's really high potency. But if it's not evenly distributed, that's a good indication that you have an issue in the way that the socks are being packed, or that tells me that you're leaving it in there for an hour and you have slow recovery. Both are common issues, but really the way to find out if you're packing enough or not enough, you've got to do it through testing. If you have residual content left in that material afterwards, you can improve on that. Sometimes improving on that efficiency comes at the cost of more filtration later, and those are, new tests for you to run. But man, if you don't test your material after extraction, I bet you are throwing away money every day.
Mhm. Yep. Okay, guys. Well, that wraps our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for all your questions. And um, appreciate Murphy and Imran for joining us as well, and sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with the community. So, hope you guys have an amazing week, and we'll wrap it up there. Cheers,
For
guys.
sure. Reach out if you guys want to buy new stuff or extract faster.
See you
Thank
guys.
you. Take care.